Most people on here probably know me as a video editor, which I am, but my arguably even bigger passion is photography. And that's why I was so excited to have won my first competition. And I kind of wanted to go through the series of photos that I won it with. And that then led to me starting to write this script, which kind of then developed into this whole story about how I developed my style and how I almost gave up on photography as a whole at one point. So let's go through all that led up to those photos even being taken and then go through those photos themselves. I technically started my journey with photography sometime around 2014. I don't really remember why, but I had this growing interest which led to me starting to take pictures with what must have been like an iPhone 5 back then. And this would eventually lead to me nagging my parents about getting me a proper DSLR, which they eventually gave into back in like the December of 2016. During that time, my family was living in Spain for a bit, and while that would mean that the setting in these early photos was quite different, you could still spot the two areas or subjects that I've held on to until this day. And those would be street photography and experimentation with black and white imagery. Looking back, it's quite clear to see the roots of my current style in these images. A lot of them are quite rough, but it's still my work. And this continues after moving back to Finland, all the way through 2017, which is kind of where this ends for a while. I don't really have a clear reason why, but looking back now, it was just kind of life happening. I was pretty stressed out with school, going from high school to gymnasium. I was spending a lot of time trying to socialize with friends and just didn't really have that kind of passion for photography at that time. But it didn't really feel right. I was doing okay at school, but I felt really aimless. I had no idea what I wanted to pursue after finishing that degree, and that started to weigh on me, and it showed. That's when actually my mother noticed this, and she came to me with a suggestion. What if I pursued photography and drawing, which I did at the time, by applying to a vocational college? And so I did. And it was during that summer, before going to that vocational college, that I found my passion for photography again. And once again, this came in the form of street photography and black and white imagery. I got a new, better camera, and I started to go on walks to take photos again, like I used to back in Spain, and my style really began to develop again. And then came one of the two foundational series of photos that really ignited that embering passion that I had been slowly feeding. And that was my family's trip to Japan. Not only did I fall deeper in love with photography during that trip, I also made like an edited travel vlog-ish type of video out of it, and that kind of explains where I got this passion to make these photography videos then. This trip really gave me the confidence to believe that I could do stuff like this, that I could create art to showcase to the world and have fun while doing it, and that street photography was definitely one of those things that I was extremely passionate about. And I don't mean it like made me want to become like a YouTuber or something. I absolutely do not want to be one, but that trip really made me feel like I had a unique artistic view that I could share. I mean, some of these photos are still some of my favorites I have ever taken. I mean, this metro station one or this taxi one, I'm genuinely extremely proud of these two. And after that trip, I just kind of kept on grinding, so to speak, slowly experimenting, improving, and finding myself and my style. And at this point, let's talk a bit about that style. I'm a fairly antisocial person, and I think it shows in my style of street photography, which is less focused on the interactions of humans and society or their environment, and at least I think it often has this more outside looking in type of mood and tone. It's more shy and less focused. It often feels like it's not quite sure what it's looking for in a way that I find quite enjoyable. My subjects are often street corners or architectural details. Because I have a hard time understanding people, I try to capture feelings through the environment. Often this comes across as this soft, melancholic feeling, a kind of alone that I don't really see as sad, more just a calming stillness. This also influences my black and white photography, in which I often try to reduce that loud, confusing noise of the world down to simple paintings of light and shadow. I love drawing out the color of a scene to give more focus to the strong emotions of large, rough lines and high contrasts. It's always fascinating to me the difference that turning an individual scene into black and white makes. When I'm walking out there taking photos, there's this sort of intuitive feeling when I feel like a scene would look good in black and white. I'm sure other people who do black and white photography can empathize with that feeling. So we found one of those foundational series that really built on my street and black and white photography. But for those who have watched my photography videos before, you might feel like there's a genre that's kind of missing here. So we go back to March 2020. I'm doing one of my photography walks when I happen upon an empty shopfront. It's late afternoon in April and the sunlight hits the large street-facing windows just right to create these beautiful lines on the floor of the empty store. And I immediately stop and just kind of stare, mesmerized. There's a lonely mirror on one of these pillars that divide the large empty hall, and this is the first time I remember that feeling, that deep, melancholic feeling I find in abandoned places. And that feeling grabbed me and just would not let go. And I've already made a video about this, so I won't go into the philosophy that I have with abandoned places, but yeah, this is where my love for abandoned places really set in. And these pictures I took that day are not the second foundational series, but they would lead me to the place where that series was taken. So of course, after taking these photos and editing them, I showed them to my parents, and they really liked them. And around this time, my father had started to use my old camera to fuel his own interest in photography. So he would suggest a photography trip to a nearby abandoned sawmill and an abandoned school. And that trip is that second foundational pillar. While a lot of this definitely shows how new I was to this style, like with the Japan trip, there's a lot of photos here that I really think are among my best work. And taking those pictures felt really good. I knew that this was what I was passionate about. Creating paintings of light, color, and shadow, these stories built within moments lasting fractions of a second. So I pushed deeper into that ocean of creativity. I began experimenting more. I picked up film photography and started to, for the first time, purposefully refine my style and practice photography. I started to actively look for abandoned places to photograph. I also began to develop a tiny bit of confidence in front of the camera through self-portraits, and I also started to incorporate more portraits as a whole into my style. I got even further out of my comfort zone and started to take short videos about these trips that I took. So at this point, it's starting to be late 2021. And it's been a bit over 2 years since I started to get back into photography. A bit over a year since I really found my love for abandoned places. And life is starting to happen again. I mean, school is getting busier with my graduation coming closer, with social responsibilities getting larger. I've started working with Disrupt, which means video editing is occupying a larger part of my hobbies. And so I get kind of scared. Am I gonna be burning out again, like I did in 2017? But luckily, no, not even in the slightest. Even with a lot going on, I still find myself loving photography. It becomes a sort of escape, a really pure form of my artistic expression. And I really mean there was a lot going on during that time. I went on to win an award for National Vocational Competition in Graphic Design while having 2 editing/production jobs, while moving out and finishing both my gymnasium and vocational diplomas. Still, none of that felt as accomplishing as getting a good shot. I was loving photography, and I think it really showed in my work. During 2022, I really feel like I found my footing with abandoned places. I started to make videos again. I pushed myself to refine that style further, but without setting myself any real limits. It was that creative drive that allowed me to make Alone, which is a very personal project for me. It was also that drive and confidence that allowed me to submit my photos to the Minun Ouluni photography competition in late-ish 2023. Now let me be a bit vulnerable here. While I love photography as just an artistic medium for myself, I'm only human. There is that part of me that really doubts my art. And that insecurity is fed by having very limited feedback. And it felt really good having your art recognized through these kinds of achievements like winning a competition. So here we are, finally in 2024, and finally at the competition. The story part of the video is over, but with all of that context that we just went through, I want to go through the series and talk a bit about them. So here are the two series that I submitted. Six pictures each, one in color and one in black and white. Now the intention of the competition was to show places in the city which were important to you in some way. And I immediately thought of that weird, midway forgotten feeling of abandoned places. Both of the series are about change, and through that, about the ever-changing nature of the city. The color series leans more towards being about places, while the black and white series is more personal with the viewer, working to reinforce the ideas about those places. Now, when I talk about these photos, it is important to note that of course, these are just my interpretations of these photos and thus only one of the possible ways to interpret them. I don't want these to be taken as explanations of these photos, but as an explanation of why I chose them. Even after these few years, this shot just keeps being one of my favorites. I especially like the large, foreboding darkness, which takes up much of the frame, creating a very nice contrast with the lighter, more dynamically posed subject of the photo, which is a school desk. There's a lot of symbolism you can draw from it, about young people feeling abandoned, about the real or perceived degradation of the schooling system, about the cold, harsh feelings that school might evoke to those who have been bullied, etc. But you can also see it as a kind of triumph of education, even in this cold, abandoned environment. All of this also plays with the composition, which is reminiscent of school photos, with the subject in a slight angle centered in a school gymnasium. Like I said, there's a lot there, and I really love this shot. Hazy Visage has a very cluttered composition, with a lot of individual points fighting over your attention. To me, this photo is about this window, which, while not being broken, is still useless as a window. It's without purpose. And while in this image it does offer us a reflection of the outside world, even that is just a hazy visage of this kind of contrasting, calmer feeling. I often use showers as subjects in my photos of abandoned places. I think it's because I enjoy the kind of irony of having this place of cleanliness and water, and through that, this kind of place of rebirth, be seen in this kind of bleak and unkept form. The composition is very claustrophobic, with many points of interest being cut off or just barely within frame. I think there's also this certain kind of melancholy which the plant, the only thing here that's alive, feels. It is the only sign of life in this womb or otherwise life-giving type of space which otherwise feels so unnaturally bleak. I also like the framing of viewing this as nature taking over this human-dominated space and thus having it be born again as a new type of space. With refraction, I wanted to play around with specifically light, in this space with many objects which distort, reflect, or refract it. I really like the both symbolic and real idea of two worlds that mirrors often offer. And here I tried to have that come through with the mirror world having a slightly more toned down green hue and stronger lighting. That is then contrasted with the broken light bulb and this kind of hazy reflection of the light coming from the outside in the foreground. passage is comparatively less abstract. It has multiple smaller elements which all reinforce this central feeling of movement. The framing with the hallway creates a strong directional pull, and with hallways being this kind of symbolic two-dimensional space, which extends either only forward or backwards, it plays nicely into the other elements, like the series of doors with light, which seems to kind of get stronger the further it goes, flooding through them, or the breadcrumb-like pieces of trash, which the immediate foreground is completely devoid of, or the clock waiting for you at the end of the passageway. Once again, there's a lot of symbolism and meaning you can draw from here. I think it talks about journeys, about the passage of time, and about a type of rite of passage. I really like Monolith. I like the strong, simple shapes and the very monochromatic colors. For me, it was fun to pull this image into these simple shapes and see a massive black monolith standing against the sea, reaching past the horizon and into the cloudy sky above, and then drag it back from the shapes and into the realm of symbols, and see the doorway as a gateway from light to dark, from known to unknown, from the abandoned now to the unborn non-existence of future. I think the mood it sets is one of uneasiness, and that's reinforced by these horror movie-esque dragging marks that lead into this darkness past the walls that are painted with colors indicating calmness. And I think that uneasiness is a kind of monolith as well. Dead End plays around with these motifs, subjects, and ideas, which all seem to kind of unsatisfyingly not conclude, with gaps being left by the light, by the ventilation duct, and by the composition itself. It all builds on an unfinished dead-end kind of feeling, which feels anxious rather than conclusive. In a larger sense, it tries to visualize that similar kind of feeling which the city seems to have, and which these abandoned places have. Watchtower is a good example of the depth offered by turning images black and white. It has a weird sense of scale, feeling massive then small, feeling like it's reaching so high but somehow having the point furthest away from you feel like it's very close. There's a lot of contrast both literally but also with the harshness of the metals and the playfulness of the lights peeking over the railing, serving as these kind of human-like figures. This especially builds strongly on the overall theme of foreboding authority, with that feeling of inconsistent scale working as a kind of visualization of that feeling of not knowing if you're being watched or not. This is probably my least abstract one out of these series, leaning much more towards a kind of harsh, realism type of visual as well as feeling. Our city has a lot of shops that have been closing down, especially in the city's center. I wanted to kind of capture that feeling without specifically using an actual closed down shopfront. I like how the nature around it reinforces that solitude which the picture evokes. I think it makes the building feel more significant, which is a contrast to an actual shopfront in the city, which I think feels much more like a broken cog in a machine. What I mostly like about this picture is that contradictory feeling of loneliness. This is a place where people shouldn't really be spending time at, but the chairs indicate that a person kind of should be there, right? So it creates this feeling of like, why aren't there people there? And that can evoke commentary about why it feels empty. Why would we expect such places to have people in them? And if that's because people don't really have other spaces. Graffiti and newspapers are both platforms which can be used to display political statements. I really like the composition of this photo. I think it really plays well into that idea that graffiti isn't as respected as the newspaper, but is still powerful. In this case, quite literally being both the subject in focus over the newspaper, but also covering parts of the newspaper. I also really like the visual of words taking up the form of a middle finger. Once again, this one is specifically not deep, it's not an abstract message, but it's not pretending it needs to be. It's politics after all. I think Portrait is simple at the surface, but it has a lot more to offer. It plays on the perception that a building that's being demolished is broken, or not as good as a building that is whole. And it definitely has that side too. It is a portrait of a broken city, of a broken person, a broken idea. Taking this kind of candid architectural photo of a building being demolished is kind of like taking a portrait of a human with horrible gashes across their face. But I don't think it has to be just a portrait of something that's broken. I think it's also a portrait of something that's in the middle of change. It's a portrait of someone who's been taking estrogen for a few months. It's someone who's coming out of the closet. It's a portrait of the city in the middle of change. And I think seeing both of those sides is simply about perspective. And that's it. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I would love to hear your thoughts, critiques, and perspectives about the pictures, so do let me know down in the comments. Anyway, I'm really hoping to participate in more competitions and possibly have more exhibitions in the future, and well, really hoping to just take more pictures in general. So, see ya at some point in some form, maybe. Alright, bye.